Hello, Tanso. Joining me on the papers this October 4th, 2018. I'm Gladys. I'm Botiban. This morning we begin with the Post newspaper that captions on the CPDM rally that held in Boya in the southwest region of Cameroon that was yesterday, October 3. The paper tells us how tricks militants and separatists and holds the Boya campaign rally and tells us how the mayor Patrick Ekema intercedes for amber fighters and militants that were ferried in from Douala and the nation's capital, Yaoundé. It equally informs us how former Prime Minister Peter Mafani Musonge Jankwete lambasted and accused opposition of abandoning the northwest and southwest regions of the country. If you want the details of the CPDM rally that held in Boyo in the southwest region of Cameroon yesterday, then you need to read pages 3 and 5 of today's edition of the bi-weekly The Post newspaper. Then the Post again tells us about the 2018 presidential election and focuses more on advocates for regime change that wants opposition coalition. The details of that you will find in today's edition of the Post newspaper, which again tells us about the electoral body elections Cameroon Elecam that insists, or the Elecam bars Prime Minister and others from voting in Bamendel in the northwest region of the country. The details you have in the Post newspaper. Then we have CONAC, the Anti-Corruption Commission that warns against corruption during the upcoming presidential election, and how the United Nations officials call for investigations into Cameroon killings. You have that in today's edition of the Post newspaper. Then let's talk about the Sun newspaper, which focuses or captions on the October 7th presidential election in Cameroon and tells us about the beer that was not in Boya in the southwest region of Cameroon, as was earlier announced. But see, the southwest CPDM stages a grand public rally and question why southwest should vote for Paul Biya. You have that in today's edition of the Sun newspaper. Then the Sun newspaper tells us about the electoral body Elecam and tells us how the presidents of the electoral boards Abrams Eber sees the IDPs, that is internally displaced persons, must vote for the upcoming presidential election. The paper tells us how the Electoral Commission, Elecam, has vowed that those who have been displaced will be able to vote according to the organizing body's regional director. You have more on that on page 2 of the Sun newspaper. In the Sun newspaper, you usually read about the United Nations and the U.S. Congress that speaks out on the current crisis rocking the two English-speaking regions of Cameroon, and informs us how the United States Congress condemns Cameroon's violent approach to resolution of the Anglophone crisis and demands the release of Sisiku Ayoktabe and others that were arrested earlier this year, and tells us again how the United Nations is to investigate killings in Cameroon. Have more on that on page 2 of the Sun newspaper. And then talking about October 1 celebrations in the northwest and southwest region of Cameroon considered Independence Day, the Sun newspaper tells us how separatists defied government's curfew and celebrated October 1 in some localities in the two English-speaking regions of the country. You have that on page 3 of the Sun newspaper. Then let's talk about sports in the Guardian Post newspaper. The paper tells us about the president of the Confederations of African Football, Ahmed, who clears air between CAF and Cameroon ahead of AFCON 2019. You have the details on page 3 of today's edition of the Sun newspaper. And in the Sun newspaper, you equally read about Hendrik Castel, who is now the new MTN Cameroon Chief Executive Officer. Read more on that in today's edition of the Guardian Post. Then let's move over to the French daily Mutation, which focuses more on the upcoming African Cup of Nations that will hold in Cameroon in 2019. The paper tells us how the president of the Confederations of African Football, Ahmed, insinuates that Cameroon will host the African Cup of Nations and clears the air over rumors that were circulating over the withdrawal rights in Cameroon. You have that in today's edition of Mutation newspaper. And in another paper this morning, we talk about Le Messager, which is another French daily. The paper talks about electoral campaigns that are ongoing all over the national territory. The paper tells us about confrontations between the CPDM party and the Social Democratic Front Party in Kribi in the south region of Cameroon. That was yesterday. The paper emphasizes how militants of the CPDM party were struggling to prevent Joshua Ossi from holding a rally in Kribi in the south region of the country. Read more on that in Le Messager newspaper. Then let's talk about the economy this morning, which focuses on public finance and tells us how the sum of 723 billion CFA francs has been allocated as unsettled debt for the Nachtigal Dam in Cameroon, and tells us that following an ordinance modified by the 2018 finance law by the head of state Paul Biya that commits the state to facilitate the advancement of the Nachtigal hydroelectricity project through contingent liability. It will henceforth be included in the budgets of Cameroon. You have that in today's edition of the Economy newspaper. Then let's talk about the English daily The Guardian Post, which equally tells us about the rally that took place in Boya, that is the CPDM rally, and tells us how Biya calls off the campaign trip to Boya where a CPDM rally was organized. You have that on the front page of the Guardian Post newspaper. Then we are told by the newspaper how the mayor of Babisi, who is from the CPDM party, has been kidnapped, but does not tell us who kidnapped the mayor of that locality. You have that on page 3 of the Guardian Post newspaper. They're talking about the crisis rocking the two English-speaking regions of Cameroon. We are informed by the Guardian Post newspaper that the CBC Health Services had hit by the Anglophone crisis, and the institutions sledges workers allowances to stay afloat. If you want more, you read page 2 of the Guardian Post newspaper, which equally informs us how the Communication Council credits the Guardian Post with a pass mark on election campaign coverage. Read the details in today's edition of the Guardian Post newspaper. Then let's talk about Cameroon business this morning, which captions on digital marketing in Cameroon. The paper tells us how 800 professionals are expected to be recruited in the domain in Cameroon, and how millions of users are expected, according to experts, and tells us how the profitable tool, or tells us more on the profitable tool for local enterprises in Cameroon. You have that in today's edition of Cameroon Business, which again tells us about the 2018 budget in Cameroon and how the sum of 21,846 billion CFA francs has been raised in 6 months in Cameroon. And talking about the south region of Cameroon, Cameroon Business focuses on factories in Bolowa and says 870 tractors have already been distributed in that part of Cameroon to revamp the sector in the country. Read more on that in Cameroon Business. Then let's talk about Le Courrier newspaper this morning, which talks on electoral campaigns around the country and focuses on President Paul Biya and development projects in the far north region of Cameroon. According to Le Courrier newspaper, the head of state Paul Biya has announced a great project or great infrastructural project in that part of Cameroon as a means to woo more voters in the Grand North region of Cameroon. The paper tells us he was in the far north region of Cameroon. That was over the weekend. You read more in today's edition of Le Courrier. Then let's talk about the M4 this morning, which, like other papers, focuses on the upcoming presidential election in the country and tells us about the force of experience that was expected in Boya in the southwest region of Cameroon during the CPDM campaign at that held at Bongo Square. You have that on page 2 of the M4. The M4 again talks about how Cameroon will host its AFCON according to the president of the Confederations of African Football. Read the details in the M4 newspaper. Let's move over to Cameroon Tribune, the national bilingual daily, which talks on the upcoming presidential election in the country and tells us about the dangerous game being played by auto-proclaimed winners of the election. According to Cameroon Tribune, some candidates are already claiming victory before the election and are openly talking about rejecting official results, and has called on the population to redouble vigilance, or to be vigilant and not to be carried away by such speeches. You have that in today's edition of the National Bilingual Daily Cameroon Tribune. Then the paper talks on the Ezeka train accidents that occurred in 2016 and tells us how government compensates affected persons. Read more on that in today's edition of Cameroon Tribune, which again tells us about the upcoming presidential election and talks on Elecam, the electoral body, which informs voters how organizing, or tells us how the voting materials are already ready 3 days to of the election proper. You have that on pages 9 to 18 of the National Bilingual Daily Cameroon Tribune. They're talking about Faker Foot. The paper tells us how a new General Assembly of the football of Faker Foot has been organized. You have more in Cameroon Tribune. Then Signature this morning talks on electoral campaigns in Cameroon ahead of the 2018 presidential elections that comes up in 3 days. The paper tells us that there are more spectators than voters, and how just few days to the electoral to the presidential election, there are more spectators at rallies than there will be in polling stations on October 7, 2018. If you want more on that, then you read Signature newspaper this October 4, 2018. And before we wrap up, let's talk about La Nouvelle Expression that equally captions on October 7 presidential election and tells us how Eno Abrams Egbe, the president of the electoral body Elecam, has insists that internally displaced persons must vote, and informs us how political parties need to organize in order to ensure the displaced persons vote in their areas. You have that on page 9 of La Nouvelle Expression. Then La Nouvelle Expression tells us how there is a possibility of a coalition ahead of the presidential election, an opposition coalition, which will involve the candidates of the CRM party of Maurice Kamto, Akere Muna, and Serge Espoir Matomba. The details of that you read on page 7 of the French daily La Nouvelle Expression. That article takes us to the end of today's edition of the papers on Canal de English. Thanks for watching.